Hello, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a show about things that are seen out of the corner of one's eye. This is a show about mysteries and enigmas. In this show we try to get at what really is the nature of the truth. What is reality? What isn't? I'm Dan Hall, one of your hosts. Tonight we join an episode of Anomalies dealing with this very subject of what is true and what isn't true. The art of debunking. The art of showing what is true to actually be false. Politicians use this. Skeptics of the paranormal use this. Tonight my co-hosts and I, Sara Thiessen and Dave Jinks, will be talking about what should be debunked and what shouldn't be. We're glad you're with us.
Why would somebody want to debunk an idea?
Well, debunk also means bunk, right? Means it's nonsense. So debunking means to expose the nonsense. Is how I think of it as a debunker's job.
Expose the nonsense.
But a debunker, that means the debunker is operating from the principle that what they're talking about is bunk already, right?
I never thought about the definition of bunk.
Well, there's a good Seinfeld show where they say, "Oh, that's a bunch of bunk," or that's debunking. Well, if you were debunking, wouldn't it be bunk? And then they go through this whole thing.
Logically. But what I think of is when we were talking earlier about people like Michael Shermer, who is somebody who debunks a lot of paranormal kinds of things, and also the amazing Randi, the magician who offers $1 million reward if you can prove that there's such things like ghosts.
According to his rules, though, and when you look at the rules and you've looked at the people who've seriously considered it, they've all said, "You got to be kidding me! That's so biased that it couldn't possibly be a scientific test." The goal is for Randi to figure out how to debunk anything, and so no one's ever taken him up. Of course, he can say that in his publicity. He says, "Well, no one's ever taken up my $1 million challenge." And it's because it itself is bunk, in my opinion, when you look at it. But anyway.
But to me, and I agree with the logic of what debunk should mean, but that means like those guys should be defending reality. But to me, what they're trying to do is they're trying to distort reality. They're taking a UFO story or a ghost story and simply saying, well, that just can't be. Just because you can't prove that scientifically, that can't be. That seems to be debunking, and that doesn't have a lot to do with reality, in my opinion. And
it's not a full analysis. I think of one I think I wrote about in my book. It's been a while, so I can't remember the exact details, but basically there was an elaborate UFO sighting with multiple witnesses, and there was a light, that persisted for a long time, and the nearby Air Force said we didn't have any aircraft in the area, blah, blah, blah. So it had a bunch of supporting evidence, and the debunker waltzed in the room and said, "Oh, well, I walked through the field and I saw that there was like a little reflector on a fence somewhere, and there was another light source here, so probably it was just like the light source reflecting off of this reflector or this mirror or something, and so there you go, case closed." That's what Shermer and Randi do. Because they know the assumption is that it's all bunk already, they can just, whip out some explanation which completely crumbles under any further examination. But if you're a debunker, that's what you do. You go, "Oh, it could have been this or that or whatever," even if it doesn't fit any of the evidence.
What's interesting to me is that it's like there's people who believe passionately, and then at the other end of the spectrum, there's people that want to debunk that. People try to debunk Christianity, to debunk UFOs, paranormal activity, Sasquatch, and then there's the individual's personal experience that they may not be a passionate believer, but they're not a disbeliever because they've had some encounter, and that the debunkers are debunking that personal
because they're
authority.
They're disbelievers, I think. A good definition of debunker is a disbeliever. They're coming from the position that I don't believe that's possible, and therefore I'm going to prove that it isn't. And sometimes they prove it, in quotes, on the flimsiest of evidence. But like I said, because the assumption is of the mass media or the scientific community that Bigfoot is not real, even the flimsiest excuse from a noted debunker is going to hold as much weight as vast amounts of evidence from, like Sarah says, individual who had individual testimony and personal experiences, and you may have footprints and other evidence. But Michael Shermer's word is going to be held up as more important because he's the scholarly, the debunker, the reasonable one. At least that's the way it's portrayed in virtually every show that you see. And Shermer is everywhere, right, Dan? I mean, I can't believe how he makes the rounds on every show on TV.
There's a risk to the individual. See, I think that most humans don't like to appear vulnerable or foolish, and so it's a lot safer to say that you're right, it doesn't exist, or not take the risk to exist. And it's scary to think that maybe these things do exist, because then we're less in control of our perception of reality, right? That we
and Dan had a note about Michael Shermer that I didn't know. That's true, right? What did you say his background is, Dan?
Well, and this comes from my former departmental chair knew him because they're both into biking, long distance biking, and bicycle riding. And as I recall, what the story was is that Michael Shermer was thinking about the priesthood and had that as a life's passion. And somehow, once again, this is third-party information, he became disillusioned with the priesthood, the church, God. So my friend's analysis of this is that's why he's a skeptic about anything that appears to be supernatural, because God sounds like one of the most, if you think about supernatural occurrences, God seems to be right up there at the top. So if you lose your faith, maybe that's not
Which
fair.
is just the biggest irony, because Shermer is selling himself as the ultimate rational skeptic, whatever, and I'm going to show people, and then typically the debunkers will say that you, Dan, believe in Bigfoot because you have a gaping hole in your life somewhere, so you need to fill it with this imaginary thing to make yourself feel better, or make yourself feel not as alone, or give excitement to your life, or that's the kind of psychology, the armchair psychology that these guys do. And so I find it extremely ironic that may be the exact psychodynamic going on with Michael Shermer, is that he's trying to fill a hole in his life by being Mr. Skeptic. Well, I knew I was right when I got disillusioned with God and whatever. I mean, not that you can't get disillusioned with religion and that's a whole other subject, but if he's accusing other people of these psychological issues, he should probably look in the mirror and look at himself. And I'm amazed at how frequently he shows up as the resident skeptic. He's made a career out of being that guy.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's his product that he sells. And there's a third part of this that I'm thinking of, because we all know that throughout history there have been fake psychics and people who say they're shamans and they aren't, and they do fraudulent things. There is that element, just like in any profession. There are charlatans, doctors, lawyers, teachers, you name it. So you've got that kind of phenomenon, and that is also maybe why people like the debunkers are so successful, because they focus on fraudulent things. And it's good to be aware of fraud. Like the people that call you on the phone and tell you that you owe the IRS money. Right,
or the emailer from Nigeria, the Nigerian prince who says, "Dear kind sir, I have $300 million that I can deposit. If you just give me your checking account number, I'll put it on in there." And
so I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I want to go back to something that Sarah said, because I'm the kind of guy that seeks out people who are willing to tell me strange things that have happened.
Yes.
So this last week, in the place I live, in the common area, met this person I kind of know, and I don't know what we're talking about. I think she's being ripped off by somebody, but somehow the conversation turned toward the paranormal. And she proceeded to tell me two very interesting stories. One having to do with her encounter with UFO, and another having to do with her two encounters she had with Bigfoot. And they're not extraordinary. Well, the one was kind of extraordinary, but what I'm thinking about from what Sara said here is that her hesitancy to tell that story, because she found in me, obviously, somebody who's open to those kind of stories. But if the role of the debunker is to force people or influence people like that not to tell their stories, I wonder about the effect on the person. Because you have this extraordinary event that's happened to you, you want to tell somebody, maybe you don't have an immediate family you could share that with. What do you do with that? You can't talk about it, or you don't want to talk about it because you're afraid that somebody's going to view you as less than normal or something. So I think this whole discussion of debunking is important in some respects, two respects, because it allows us, if we hear these stories, extraordinary stories, and we don't have to look at them through the filter of being debunked, then I think we find out more about reality. We find out more about what the real world is all about. And we also allow people who maybe have been traumatized in some way or have had an important event, share that event without being ridiculed. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm thinking of an example right now of how the combination of debunkery that's rampant and, as Sara mentioned, the history of fraudsters, hoaxsters, charlatans over the years, that's like a perfect storm to prevent us from understanding the truth, because you got the fakers who do it for fortune and fame, and then you have the debunkers who are focusing on the fakers, and then the rest of us are kind of caught in the middle going, well, I don't know, there might be some real something in between, right? Between the fakers and the guys who say there's nothing interesting going on in the world. But it takes so much effort to go learn about that. You got to weed, separate the wheat from the chaff, that whole thing. So yesterday I went to Coast, which I don't know if you guys saw that, but one of the big videos was Chinese UFO. Did you see that?
No, I didn't.
Well, it's this video, and I went to it, and there's this, appears to be a large craft slowly crossing the sky, and it's a picture of a freeway, and all these Chinese drivers, are out on the freeway. They all stopped their cars, and there had to be dozens of them holding up their smartphones, going, oh my God, tracking this thing across the sky. And so I sit there and I look at that for a minute, and I'm like, could be interesting. And then I close the website and I go look somewhere else. And I'm thinking, my reaction to that, I think, is the result of the problem I just said, which is the hoaxers and the debunkers. Because I look at that and I'm like, well, okay, so you have multiple witnesses. You got this obvious thing in the sky. Apparently you've got dozens of pieces of evidence. You could potentially go to look at those phones, that film, and I'm thinking, why wasn't I that interested enough in it to pursue it? And I know why, and that's that I think it could be a hoax, even though it seems very elaborate. But I also know that the debunkers are going to come up with, within seconds, they will have some, quote, explanation, unquote. So what it does, exactly what Dan is saying, is that it kind of suppresses in ourselves the curiosity, the motivation to get to the truth. And I see it myself, and it's kind of sad that was my reaction. 20 years ago, I would have been like, oh my God, I would have been running down the streets going, look at this, can you believe? And now I'm kind of like, well, it could be real or not, and that's the result. Unfortunately, it's toxic, I think, to the process of the scientific process, but the process of self-discovery and self-actualization and all that. So what do you guys think about that?
It just promotes cynicism. That's what I think. You just become cynical about everything. Because always in the back of your mind, it could be a hoax. And that's been planted there by people like Randi and Shermer. Maybe we shouldn't diss on them so much, but they're, that's what they do.
And it's so much easier to hoax these days, too. So you got to blame the hoaxers, too. So Randi and Shermer aren't all at fault in the problem, but they certainly contribute to it. And, how do we get out of that situation? And who does cynicism benefit the most is what the next question is. Because somebody really doesn't mind all that cynicism because it makes us do nothing as a citizenry.
Right.
And my answer is, I'm sure, the same as yours. Who benefits from that populace who is basically paralyzed?
And the answer is the government.
The government, the intelligence agencies, the military-industrial complex, of course, the $1 trillion a year that they get to throw at black projects, and Congress basically signs the check and looks the other way. Of course, they love that because we're not going to question them, and it's a pretty easy arena to operate in when nobody is holding you accountable for anything.
I want to tell this story that this woman told me because I think it's an interesting story. And maybe that doesn't have so much to do with the government debunking things, but certainly has something to do with her willingness to share a traumatic event. So this person is living in Richmond, Virginia, back in the 1970s. She's living by herself, I believe, with a dog. She goes out to take her dog for a walk. And she happens to look up in the sky, and this is what she described to me. She described 4 spheres of light, and I don't really know, we didn't get into the size or color, white in color, yellowish in color, but they're like 4 corners of a square, and they're in that position as she comes up the sky, and she says, well, that must be something. She comes up with a rational explanation of that, until the 4 orbs or spheres start moving around. Crisscrossing, going diagonally. One takes, if you would cut a square diagonally in half, the spheres were changing position. Then they all started going in a circle, like that. So it was
When was this?
In the 70s, I believe. And you couldn't imagine a rational explanation for something like that. If it was a craft that just had lights, the 4 corners of the craft were the landing lights, and that's what she was looking at. This behavior with the lights reforming into a circle and then going diagonally, that just doesn't fit that. So she watches this for maybe 10 minutes and is just trying to figure it out. And I don't recall that her dog necessarily reacted to this, but she says, I've got to go inside, and this makes me uncomfortable. So she goes inside, and she's living in an area where there are other people. It's kind of residential, but there's nobody else out in the street looking at this. She goes inside and sits in there for a while and says to herself, I need to go out there and see if this is still going on. So she goes out there and sees that it's still going on, that these 4 spheres are moving around in the sky, and just really, sometimes they're in 4 corners of a square, and sometimes they're a circle. Anyway, doing stuff that she just can't explain. And then she says, I start to get nervous because I wonder what this is. And somehow, maybe she had read about the UFO phenomena and had read about the abduction phenomena. Mm-hmm. So she's getting nervous. So she says, I need to go back in. She goes back into her house, and her dog immediately goes to its bed and just is kind of frozen in the bed there, not reacting to anything. And then she says the piece de resistance happened. And I want you to think back, if you could, to that scene in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the mother and the little boy in the farmhouse are hearing some of these weird sounds and seeing some of this UFO activity. And specifically in that scene where some of the kids' toys, which are electronic, come to life and start moving around. So what happened to her, and this maybe isn't as dramatic at that scene, but the dog had some squeaky toys, and they were just laying on the floor. The dog's in the bed, not anywhere near the floor. The squeaky toy compresses and squeaks and then releases like that. And there is no evidence in her scheme of things as to how that could happen, because the dog didn't have the toy in its mouth. She wasn't touching the toy, but it's like some unseen force was squeezing on that toy and then causing the squeak to come out. Well, that really freaks her out. And so she goes outside, but when she goes outside the 3rd time, nothing's there. There's nothing in the sky. And so she, once again, feeling anxious, what's going to happen to me? And particularly when something appears to invade her house and do something in the house, and it's something that she can't see. So she doesn't tell anybody about that. Maybe one family member, but pretty much leaves that subject alone. 2 weeks later, in the Richmond, Virginia newspaper, there's a photograph of these spheres that someone else took and gave to the newspaper, and they published that. But what I'm reacting to in this story is her anxiety in talking about this, and what the effect of Michael Shermer / the amazing Randi, their perspective that nothing like this could ever happen, how that affects somebody who had an fairly extraordinary experience as far as she's concerned, happened, how that perspective affects that.
Well, okay, so she's a senior, right?
She's over 60 years age.
Over 60 years old, over 66, is that what you said?
Well, over. Let's just say she's over 60.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'm thinking is also throughout history, we have imprisoned, burned at the stake, thrown in mental institutions, people who have experiences that we don't understand. Because in the Dark Ages, it was like, oh my God, the devil's got them. Somehow Satan is working through this person. So I could see in an earlier time where someone might be afraid they'll be thrown in a mental hospital if they say this out loud. I mean, I think it's really hard for humans to understand other human experiences that they haven't had. And this even goes into things like women being assaulted, sexually assaulted. It's also racial injustices. White people will listen to people of color and think that couldn't have happened because they can't imagine themselves doing it. That must not be real. They're exaggerating that. And so I think we're talking about sort of a phenomenon. I don't know if it's a lack of compassion, curiosity, just not wanting to test your beliefs or to accept someone else's reality.
Empathy or the ability to empathize. And I think Sarah had what I would describe as a perfect segue into another subject, which I think we were going to touch on just because we're at that time of the year, or that time of the decade when we have an election coming up. Less than a month, right? Yeah. And Sarah is basically describing xenophobia, right? The fear of the other, or even if it's not outright fear, it's lack of empathy, lack of the ability to understand somebody in a different lifestyle, a different position, different experiences. Obviously, the paranormal, there's lots of other dynamics going on there because, like Sarah said, even today, you could be considered crazy, even though everyone believes. I mean, I know the majority believes that the government is lying about this or that and that UFOs are a non-trivial phenomenon, but yet we still all are pretty hesitant to bring it up, except for when you get in a group like this where some of us like to talk about it, but I'm not going to go. I have a professional career, and so do you, and Dan used to before he got
retired.
Yeah, put out the pasture.
Put out the pasture. But there's still that stigma, and so I don't know if you guys think that this is a good time to swing a little bit into that other topic, but I think, Donald Trump is a beacon. Is it a beacon or a magnet? I'm not sure, but whatever. He has riled up more than anyone in recent history the group of people that you could describe as xenophobic when it comes to, lots of different groups. It's not just Mexicans or gays, although I don't really know what his stance is on same-sex marriage or whatever. Has he talked? I mean, I have to admit, I don't listen to Trump on purpose. And I'm not a big Hillary fan either, so just to get that out there and make it clear that I think we have two choices. We have a billionaire and we have a multi-millionaire. Those are our two choices. A millionaire warmonger, because she's been involved in plenty of military-industrial complex follies. And then we have Trump, who's sort of an unknown quantity, which I think is part of his appeal to some of his supporters, is they somehow have determine that he's an outsider, which I have to admit I've not heard an argument yet that convinces me that that could be anywhere near true in terms of being totally outside of the system. He's certainly firmly entrenched in the corporate side. Mm-hmm. Maybe he hasn't been a politician, but he's entrenched in the system. But anyway, I'll let you guys move into that area because, I think it flows with what Sarah was saying.
Well,
in terms of why Trump is so appealing to what appears to be a large, segment of the population in America, at least.
Well, I think that this interest in these, they're not really third-party candidates, but they're outsider candidates. Bernie Sanders had a huge following, and then Trump. And I think that, in some ways that's hopeful because people are discouraged on both sides of the spectrum, and they are looking for alternative solutions. And some people have believe in Trump's way, and other people more in the progressive way. And let's see, what am I thinking? So
why,
yeah,
in terms of this fear of the other, I think, is kind of what we're looking at, or fear of, there are all sorts of fears. Americans have no shortage of fear when it comes to how they operate on a day-to-day basis. We're very fear-based. Humans in general, but I think Americans are pretty scared of a lot of stuff. Yeah. That's why we have a large contingent, and I apologize to the libertarians in our audience if we have any. I think anytime someone starts going off about gun rights and, Hillary's going to take our guns away, my first thought is, what are you so scared of?
Yeah.
Why do you need to be armed to the teeth? Why do you need an arsenal? Why do you need a gun under your pillow? Those sorts of things. What has gotten us to this point where there's such fear? And again, setting aside whether there is reason to be fearful, because I can come up with a lot of reasons to be scared of, quote, the government or other things. But why is it ramped up to the point where someone like Donald Trump is a serious contender? Dan, you're into politics, probably more than me.
That may be a negative. I'm not sure. When we're talking about debunking, I think about this, and I don't know as to the accuracy of this, but I'm focusing more on Trump than I am on Hillary Clinton. That some people might view Donald Trump as someone who's trying to get at the truth about America, and that essentially the political parties, both Democratic and Republican parties, have been purveyors of lies and falsehood. So Donald Trump comes along and he becomes the only person telling the truth. And you can kind of put this in the debunker structure of that. Now, whether or not he is telling the truth, I think there's serious doubts about that. I mean, every time I hear Donald Trump give a speech, it seems like, or read about him, I don't listen to him particularly, there's always the fact check people that goes, well, most of what he said was a lie, so that doesn't sound like the truth. But I think that he speaks to a group of people who are tired of business as usual, and I'm talking about politics as usual, and they see him as trying to break through to the truth about that, and maybe that somehow makes him an attractive candidate. Because he's the only one really telling the truth about this. I don't know if that makes him in the same category as Michael Shermer or James Randi, trying to perpetuate a myth about the way things are. But I don't think that's how he's perceived.
That brings up something I don't want to forget it, so I have to interrupt you. But that's a really good point, in that the way I and we view somebody like Shermer or the amazing Randi is that they are cherry pickers. They don't go find the Rendlesham Forest, incident, or the Iranian pilot, incident with the UFO, or the Belgian triangles flap of 1989, 1990, whatever it was. They don't zero in on the complicated stuff that has lots of radar evidence, multiple witness testimony from pilots, and high-ranking military officials. They don't go for that stuff. They go for the low-hanging fruit. They go for the single, the stereotype of the hick in the backwaters wherever who's been drinking moonshine or something. I mean, they pick on the easy ones because most everyone is going to go, yeah, you're probably right. The odds are that. And so I see Trump as a similar type of debunker, if we're using that sort of persona, projecting it onto Trump, which I think is accurate. He's going after the low-hanging fruit. He's going after the Mexicans. He's going after the illegal immigrants who are sneaking into our country, and the indigent, the African American in the inner city who's scamming a pack of Top Ramen or something off of food stamps. I mean, those are people, or the Cadillac. What's the one that Reagan, the
welfare
queen,
right,
and the pink Cadillac or whatever, which is a total fabrication, and there never was such a person. And in fact, Reagan, his advisor, I don't know if Reagan admitted it, but his advisors, his supporters, later said, well, that was just, we made it up as an example of what could happen. And so what I see is Trump doing the same thing. He's cherry picking because he knows that most of his supporters can get together and rally against such a weak enemy, again in quotes. Whereas the true problem is the military-industrial complex, the vast banking system that has control over every aspect of our economy and our society. Those guys, it's tough to touch those guys. And in fact, someone like Trump probably would be smart not to mess with those guys, because those are the guys who got him where he is. The tax codes, he claims $1 billion tax loss. I've been on some, try not to make it a habit, but I get on debate, bulletin boards or whatever, and it's like people going, Trump is a great businessman. He's the very definition of success. And I go, okay, so success equals losing $1 billion. That's
right.
My wife and I have run a corporation for 20 years. If I lost $1 billion, I would have been out of it, or even $1 million, or much less, actually. I would be...
You wouldn't be a successful business.
I would not be, the definition of success. So, again, I think he is debunking in the way that Shermer and these other guys do that. So what do you guys think about that? Does that seem like an accurate... has Trump targeted more powerful enemies, the ones who really are at the root of a lot of our problems?
Well, I guess
my
first reaction is it's like he's a myth spinner.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he's maybe presenting it like the truth, and like I'm actually maybe the debunker. I'm telling you that our immigrants don't add anything to our culture or economy. That's a myth. They are actually rapists and criminals.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if the word debunk is exactly the concept. I think is there. I don't know if those would be the right words.
Yeah, he's more
to use.
Cynical and evil than I think just a debunker who tries to remove certain types of evidence from the discussion or whatever. Trump he's not pulled any punches when it comes to trying to rile up certain emotions and support.
Well, maybe he's tried to debunk the American, I don't know if I want to say myth, and what is the American myth, but this idea that our diversity is not who we are, it's something to fear, and that we're all living lives of hell, and
well, I'm interested in Dan's take on
yes.
the Trump campaign's slogan, "Make America Great Again."
Well, as I was listening to Sarah in particular about weaving some stories that are essentially a myth, I think that's what Donald Trump is doing. I think he is trying to create a reality, and maybe this is what we're, to relate it back to the first part of the conversation, this is what debunkers do. They try to create a different reality, a narrative that favors them. And certainly the narrative that he's creating doesn't comport very well with the truth, that every immigrant is either a member of ISIS or a Mexican rapist, that women are pigs and dogs and to be treated as sexual objects, That's all to benefit him. But what Dave's got me thinking about here is, when the government in the past has debunked certain things, particularly in the field of UFOs, or some of their representatives have debunked those topics, there's an agenda there. There's an agenda to keep the truth from the American public about whether or not we're being visited by UFOs when we're talking about that topic. So Trump's agenda is what? To get elected. Or if not to get elected, at least to, and you hear a lot of pundits talk about this, enhance his brand name, to get richer, to become more powerful in that way. So maybe his debunking of what mainstream thought has to do with a narrative that benefits himself. And that's, of course, what you don't want. I don't think what I want in a leader. I don't want a demagogue. I don't want an egomaniac to run the country. I want somebody we have plenty of problems in the country, so I want somebody to solve those problems. And that Donald Trump doesn't strike me as that. But he's instilled in a lot of people the belief that he could do that because of his qualities. Right. Good businessman, good deal maker, will stand up to people that need to be stood up to.
I mean, the one thing about that narrative, again, and I think it was George Bush Jr., right, who was the first person to say, I'm going to be a CEO president, I'm going to run the country like a business. And if you know anything about this country, or anything about a business, you realize that those two are completely incompatible. A business is a kingdom. It has a king, or in my case, a queen. My wife owns it. She's president, right. Treasurer, CEO, right. CFO, every O. She's an owner. And what she says goes. She is the queen. I mean, she could shut it down today, and it wouldn't matter. She'd be perfectly within every right of the law to do that. So to have somebody running a constitutionally limited representative democracy, or some version of that, which is what we have, the idea that you want to run this country or any other country as a business is pure insanity. So the fact that people have bought into, well, Trump is such a good businessman, which in itself is questionable, but even if you take that as a given, if you think that that's a good idea for the vision that our founders have, you are completely mistaken. And I don't think there's any arguing that. So can Trump, can he keep the Mexicans out by erecting a giant wall? Well, maybe. Is he really going to do that? I think the chances are about zero that he's going to do that because, presidents, once they get in power, they don't focus on anything like that. They don't prevent gay marriage. They don't. All they do is go to war, basically, and they figure out ways to please the business industry and our banking masters, really. And if that's cynical, well, maybe it is, but it sure seems to be the truth.
Well, go ahead, Sarah.
No, I wasn't.
Okay. So what debunking seems to rely on, whether it be politics or some of these more paranormal topics, it relies on, and I don't want to be unkind to people because last time I looked, I fell into that category as a person. It relies on the lack of inquisitiveness. It allows, it flourishes on the lack of the ability of people to critically think, because after all, they're sort of accepting these narratives. If somebody says there are no UFOs, even if you've had a UFO experience, you're going, well, I couldn't have had that experience because people in authority are telling me I can't have that experiences. If all Mexicans are rapists, or probably a better example would be Muslims. If all Muslims are terrorists, well, then they all must be. Rely on the fact that most people won't take any time to figure out what Islam as a religion is all about, whether it in fact preaches some of the things that people who don't like people who are practitioners of Islam talk about. So this debunking, it goes back to that agenda that we referred to in the previous discussion. The agenda is to keep people stupid, to keep people from not questioning what's going on, to keep people, if you want to be a socialist about it, just somehow totally absorbed in a materialistic economy. So if I can have as many cars as I want, I'm not going to think about anything else. I'm not going to think about democracy. I'm not going to think about what direction the country's going in. I'll just live in this materialistic nirvana. Maybe that's the agenda.
And the question always is, who benefits, right? That's what, qui bono in Latin. Qui bono? Who benefits?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you always have to answer that question. Who? Because things don't happen by accident, largely. And we'd be incredibly naive to not assume that the people who have power don't want to do everything they can to retain power.
Right.
All you have to do is look at every level of society. Look at yourself. I don't want to lose my standard of living. If I end up with an extra bill or whatever, I feel like, I went backwards this month. Or, you people who have the power to do things and maintain the position will do so. So who benefits? I think obviously Trump, I agree that this appears to me to be someone who said, I've done pretty much everything I could, why don't I just try to be president now? And I doubt that he even believed it was possible in the beginning. It was a good resume builder thing, like Dan said. And now that he's so close, he's starting to think, oh my God, maybe.
In some ways, I see Trump as, I don't know what the word would be, when you send, fox hunting, don't they use dogs? Or is that what it is? They use dogs to flush out wildlife.
Birds,
maybe it's
sure,
bird hunting.
Do they do it with foxes?
They might do that. They might do that with foxes too.
Yeah.
But I feel like Trump is like the dog. He has flushed out xenophobia, racism, every other kind of ism, every just vulgar behavior, and brought it out in the open. Now, obviously, it's always been there, or he wouldn't be as far along as he is. And I think, it's not a coincidence that Black Lives Matter is happening now at the same time that there's this rise in this kind of hate, make America hate again. So I think on some, if you wanted to talk about planetary consciousness, some kind of higher, I don't know if the word is metaphysical or meta understanding of things, it almost feels like things are being orchestrated to make us deal with the powers of good and evil. You could be that dramatic about it. Mm-hmm. And as Dan was saying, that he's taking a climate change class right now, and we're in danger of losing Earth, right?
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's the other thing I think we want to go to.
Yeah.
This class, and I give a huge shout out to Sara Thiessen, who is the coordinator of lifelong learning at the Senior Center. One of the course offerings this quarter is climate change. Not just climate change, the climate crisis. And after going to the first class, I was sitting there at the end of the class going, holy whatever. Yeah. We are in deep doo-doo here. Yeah. They just said that if things continue the way they are now, and we're talking about the heating of the earth because of greenhouse gases being trapped, in a century, Earth will be devoid of life as we know it. We can't live here because of the super storms, that's the best way I could put it, the incredible droughts, the increased temperatures, and I think the tie that this brings us to in talking about that class is this response of the earth, and some people would view the earth as a living being. I think I could go there. Some people couldn't. This climate crisis is a reaction to that. And where debunking comes into this is you have people, and I have some of them as Facebook friends, who say, well, the earth has been hotter before. Climate, we've had ice ages. it's not going to be such a big deal. But when
We've also had 5 mass extinctions,
Right.
so it's
Right.
like, yeah, you're right, and
when you look at the data, and that's what scientists deal in, they don't deal in, well, this is my opinion, they deal in the data, that the Earth is undergoing extraordinary climate changes. And the role of debunking here is to kind of say, oh no, that's not true. Let's not worry about that. And we know what that agenda is tied to. The agenda is tied to some kind of restriction of human activity that some people don't want to have restricted. You're going to have to you're going to have to do with fossil fuels. And that in that class, that's the culprit right there. There are other things that contribute to that, but fossil fuels are the culprit. And as I was sitting there in that class, I'm thinking, well, damn, our entire society is built on fossil fuels. So that's threatening. And it would be very easy to say for people to say, oh, here's a scientist that doesn't believe in global warming, or that's just a hoax, or James Inhofe, the guy who's the senator from Oklahoma, who thinks that God wouldn't allow climate change, global climate crisis, that's just against the Bible. That's irresponsible. That's really debunking the truth, because the truth is we're in a lot of trouble.
yeah, that's a lot to think about. Now, disclosure, I'm not a big global warming type. I mean, I think there are many other variables that go into it, other than just greenhouse gas. I don't think that shutting down the factories now would save us. I mean, I think we're beyond that point, right? I just read the other day 400 parts per million or whatever was always some benchmark in the makeup of the atmospheric gases and so on. And, you know, of course I saw Al Gore's, what was that?
Inconvenient truth.
Yeah, I mean, of course I saw that, and he gets on the presentation is very compelling, and I kind of walk away with a grain of salt, because I don't know how much of that, because you have agendas on the other side too, and the global warming issue unfortunately has become so polarized that you have one camp that absolutely believes everything, you got the other camp that believes nothing, and I think there's an in-between. But also you can't deny the temperature readings. This year was the hottest year on record again. I don't know how many years in a row or how many of the last 10. It's probably been like 8 or 9 of 10. But we see a lot of stuff dying too. That's the thing that scares me a lot. These mass beachings of sea life, just extinctions of all sorts of creatures, not just in one isolated area. It's not like a bunch of bugs that are dying. It's like all through the food chain. Things are going away and beyond repair in a lot of cases. And you read the scientists who are working behind the scenes, not the big out in the open guys with all the publicity giving the presentations here and there. People in the labs looking at this stuff going, oh my God, there's nothing like this in the fossil record that I've ever seen. There's nothing that I've ever seen in my 30 or 40 years of work, and I'm really worried. When you read reports from people like that, that's when you start to go, yes, Sarah, something is happening. And again, focusing all on the greenhouse gases, I think, is leaving out a lot of the equation, but that in itself is a big enough problem, and it tells us we should not rely on fossil fuels and that we should stop poisoning the place we live in, and that's just one kind of poison, right? I mean, all the other stuff we're dumping. Fukushima, we have a whole show on that. That is still spewing 5 years later. Most people, it's dropped out of the news, so they don't think about it, but that is spewing radioactive material nonstop into the ocean and hitting the west coast and other areas of the planet. And the company tried to freeze the earth around. I don't know if you read that about the frozen wall. They were going to try to freeze the earth in a radius around the leaking reactors. Mm-hmm. That failed. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And I saw an article, just a few weeks ago, frozen wall fails, no alternatives. Company throws its arms in the air and says, we give up, something like this, something really bad like that. So we're poisoning ourselves from every direction, not just from the air.
I've heard this said recently that we've got a war on science, and we have for a long time, maybe throughout history, but people do, because they are, what science often brings us, the data it brings us, are inconvenient truths to our economy, our lifestyles, our beliefs about everything. And I think tonight's show has been, we're talking about debunkers, and those debunkers are oftentimes debunking a form of science. There is paranormal science. There is climate science. What was our third theme here? I'm lost.
There is
Well, we're talking
political
about
science, not really.
Political science, looking at
There
Trump.
is political science. And, well, you could say, Trump is trying to say a businessman could run the country better than political scientists or career politicians or, I don't, from what I know about government, like you said, business and government don't necessarily go hand in hand very nicely. Because the needs of the people are usurped by the needs of capitalism, right?
And government is, by defined, inefficient. You think of the post office, for example, which is a quasi-governmental entity. Its goal was not to be FedEx and deliver everything as economically as possible and make as much money as possible. Its goal was to deliver even to podunk whatever. We've got plenty of them around where we live, all the little outlying areas and forests and whatever. Its goal was to get that person their mail in a timely manner, no matter what, through sleet, snow, rain, whatever the credo is. That was the goal for 47 cents or 49 cents, whatever it is now. It wasn't to make a profit and make some CEO richer. It was, and the same with utilities and highway systems and everything. It's the commons. It was to let every American have a chance to live the American dream without having to be focused in an area that was convenient for the company delivering it. And so for someone to say, I'm going to run the country like a business, I just say, bunk.
But, and
from
I
square
see why
one, that's
people,
wrong.
I totally get why people want to believe that. And I think it's all based on because I'm going to have a job, or my brother's going to have a job, or my kids will have jobs because a businessman knows how to generate jobs. And they think that kind of leadership would make that happen. I personally believe it would make things like deregulation and environmental disaster and all the things we're experiencing right now is the result of capitalism. I mean, throughout the world, you could say the carbon emissions, all those things, greenhouse gases, are produced largely by industry of some sort, right?
Consumption-based economy.
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about the ultimate agenda. So if the debunking of the UFO phenomena and some of these other phenomena that are paranormal, that agenda is just maybe to kind of keep us from finding out what reality is all about. If you're talking about Trump being perceived as a debunker, his agenda is getting elected or enhancing his status. If the agenda to debunk climate change is in operation, it seems like the consequences there are more dire. Because it's not about not figuring out what reality is. It's not about getting some wacko in there that we can get rid of in 4 years. It's about we're going to die. The planet, people on Earth are going to die. That seems to be a much higher stake for the debunkers to be rolling the dice for than any of those others.
Yeah.
I think part of that is you've got a group of, what's the term? Eschatologists? The end of the world, the survivalist, some people want the end of the world. They're looking to that salvation that comes after. And so I think there's a surprisingly large group of people, more than any of us would want to believe or think that actually are looking for the end times as something that could happen. And so I think underlying it, there are people who don't want to stop that. If that's, it's a twisted motivation in my opinion. I'm sure you guys would agree. That's kind of a weird way, but I think there's a way. There is some motivation that way to not believe, to disbelieve at least in the science or the suggestion that we live in a poisoned world that we should really do something about, and quickly. And then there's the money interests, of course. And then there are people who just don't believe it or don't have any clue about it also. And there's plenty to go around, I guess, that leads us to where we are. And I don't know what to do about it. If you were to ask me, I would say I care deeply, but I don't know what to do about it. So there's plenty of us who just don't know what to do, and that's why we don't do anything. Am I going to throw money at Al Gore or something? I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah.
In my sociology class, we would discuss the death penalty, and I would have a guy that you probably know, Glenn Anderson, oftentimes come to class, and he would give a presentation. So before we did the presentation, we would do an unscientific poll, straw poll. How many people in class support the death penalty or against the death penalty or unsure? And we would tally the numbers. And then we would proceed to let Glenn loose. And one of the reasons I like Glenn, even though I know what his agenda is, and not that his agenda is a bad agenda, but he's anti-death penalty. But he did a really good job of examining both pro and con arguments. So we'd have one side of the board full of why you should support the death penalty, and then one side of the board filled with why you shouldn't support the death penalty. And then we'd have a discussion that ensued. After, what I was kind of interested in, this was something that someone who teaches sociology I was interested in, then we'd do the poll again. And we'd see how the process affected the outcome of the discussion, how that affected people's points of view. And I don't think you could say that it was purely a causal kind of a thing, but inevitably the numbers never changed. So I got thinking about, well, what does this mean? And one of the things it could mean is that if you believe something, death penalty, Bigfoot, UFOs, no such thing as climate change, Donald Trump is the second coming, that you could be exposed to a bunch of logical arguments that could dissuade you from your point of view, and you won't be dissuaded. Because you don't want to be dissuaded.
Right. I'm thinking we probably want to move towards closing comments on this, and I think one of the things I would want to say that I've gotten from this conversation is the importance in questioning authority, all kinds of authority, believing in our own experience, also questioning our own experience and our own values, not letting ourselves rest on what we believed 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but continually updating, what we think, and the harm that debunking I think can do, that it's an extreme measure, an extreme strategy that is used to undermine people's experiences and make them feel foolish, and it's almost like a form of propaganda, I think, that no matter what the debunkers say, I have had experiences where I knew another entity was in the room with me, benevolent, it was mysterious, it was unseen. I've also had something call my name, and I don't expect other people to embrace my reality, but I'm going to stick by it and not let people debunk that, because it is dangerous. And my sense is that climate change is real. I see examples around that. I see Capitol Lake overflowing into Water Street. They have to pump it back out. The city's doing that right now. So, and that people who are debunkers have agendas that benefit them. So that's my closing remark. Dave, do you want to go next?
That was good. I like that closing
I
remark.
think, trusting personal experience, and I think if we had more true skeptics and fewer debunkers, because I make a distinction. Debunkers, again, I think, like I said, choose the low-hanging fruit. They choose the easy pathway. They know that it's going to get them approval by the status quo in general. That's why Shermer and whoever goes on to the TV shows, you see, because they were invited on to be that guy who says, well, you just talked about some stuff, but it's probably not real, which is what we all thought anyway, and it makes us feel more comfortable. And so thanks for saying it. Here's your paycheck. I don't know how much those guys make. They make a living out of it at least. So, but the skeptics are the ones who, they don't mess with the easy stuff. They go straight to the hardest to answer questions, and they live in that area, and they tear their hair out, and they question themselves. They go back and forth. Is this real? Is this not real? Where's the truth underlying all this? They don't go in with an agenda to prove or disprove, and of course that's very hard to do because it's very uncomfortable for, could Dan or I or Sarah go into a UFO case without the feeling like, I've read hundreds of these before, this is probably true, and still come out of it like, I've determined this is not a legitimate case. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to have to admit it. And I have one example, personal example, and that is this so-called crop circle that Dan, I'm sure, knows about my experience with it in, where was it?
Oh, in Eastern Washington?
In Eastern Washington.
That you took Wilbur.
In Wilbur, yes.
Yeah, there it is. Wilbur, Washington.
We happened to be going on vacation to Idaho right through that highway that goes close to Wilbur. And I was all excited when I heard of this thing. I was like, I got to get out there. And, I was pretty obsessive. You could ask my wife and kids. I didn't really enjoy my vacation because I was trying to figure out how to... And it was like 100 degrees, and so I was out. I finally found the thing. And I slaved away for hours measuring stuff, taking samples. I mean, I was dirty and sweaty and in pain, from bending over, because I'm getting up there in age, and sore. And after it was all over, I sent my samples and things to Nancy Talbot over in Massachusetts, I guess, with BLT Research. She's basically the only game in town who's been doing this and doing actual scientific studies of these things. And she basically said, well, Dave, this doesn't show any of the anomalies that I usually see, so it's probably a hoax. And so I accepted that. I was like, I devoted, 10 hours and my vacation to that, and probably got quite a few looks from my family about, you're doing what?
Dad's going crazy.
They know me well enough to know that I was going to do it no matter what, so they humored me. But so I had to suck it up at the end and say, this probably wasn't one of them. So I took pride in that. I thought, okay, that's what a true skeptic will do. A skeptic will stick with the criteria that you need to determine what's real and what isn't, what reality is, what truth is. So if you have skeptics, we're fine, and science is alive and well, and that includes UFOs and climate change and even political science. If you have fact checkers and truth, we're fine. But the problem, as I just demonstrated, I think, is that it's harder to be a skeptic than it is to be a debunker. It takes a lot more work, it takes mental discipline, and it's just, it's hard. And so I completely understand why we're largely a society or a world of debunkers instead of skeptics. And again, you just have to do your homework, and I think that's what we try to do here. We try to cover topics from different aspects and come up with some kernel of truth, no matter how small. At least that's my goal here. That's my goal here.
To quote the X-Files.
What about you, Dan? What are your
thoughts?
thoughts?
I think I'm going to be pretty succinct. And people have heard this from me before. Socrates, who I've become a fan of in my later years, said several things. The one most relevant to this discussion is to live a life unexamined is not worth living. And I think that is maybe, he may have had a different meaning than I have, but I think you have to question things. Questioning is not bad. But skepticism and debunking are two different things. And just to debunk something to advance an agenda, that's not being a skeptic. And I think as critical thinkers, particularly people that live in a democracy where we're supposed to be informed in making choices like the political choices we have to make here in November, it's important to be skeptical, but I think we need to be aware of those who want to debunk certain messages in this election. So that's what I'm going to say. And I enjoy hanging out with my good friends Dave and Sarah, and join us again for another episode of Anomalies.
We'll look forward to it after the election. We'll have a new president, and we'll go from there, whatever it brings us.
That'll be a real paranormal situation to be in.